May I ask you a question? Yes, but just one question. Why did you remove me from your Databricks Workspace? Oh, I was actually working with a machine learning project that had very sensitive data and machine learning assets. So I was the only person allowed to access and see them and work with them. I had to remove you. But I think you forgot that I had enough permissions to revert your changes. So I was able to get access to your Databricks Workspace again, and I saw all your machine learning assets. You must be kidding me, right? I am absolutely serious. But there are too many different machine learning assets like data, features, models, notebooks. How can I define permission level and permission or access control over all those assets in Databricks? You know what I mean? Well, now let's make a quick review video of how you can define different permission levels on different machine learning assets in Databricks. Okay? Let's go! Hello everyone, this is MG and welcome to this quick video about how we can define different permission levels over different machine learning assets that we worked with in our Databricks machine learning projects. For instance, you might be questioning that what are the best practices and different permission levels I can specify for my data or feature store or your machine learning models in MLflow or your codes and notebooks. So let's go through them all and discuss about the best practices and how you can define them in Databricks. Let's check it out.
Before we start, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon so you will get notified for the next video. Thank you.
Here's my Databricks Workspace, and what we're gonna talk about and what is the purpose of this video is actually sort of summarizing what are different components that you need to define access control over them when you're specifically dealing with machine learning type of workload in Databricks, right? So let's make it as specific towards AI and ML. And also then what are the different capabilities of access control, what are different options we can choose to make sure we are applying appropriate governance over our data and AI assets, right? So let's move on with the first item. Let me actually open up my slide. There you go. And in general, when we talk about workspace access control or workspace object access control, let's define first what are the assets that we are defining access control over them. So we are talking about workspace objects, cluster, compute cluster access control, pools of clusters access control, Databricks jobs access control, Delta Live, which are sort of Delta tables access control, and secret access control. So what we're gonna mainly focus on and start with is workspace access control. And when we talk about workspace, what do we mean? What are the objects within the workspace that you're defining access control? Well, you have your folders in workspace. That's what we are starting. You have your notebooks or codes in your workspace. You have your experiment in the workspace. You have your repository in your workspace. And when I say repo or repository, I mean as you have potentially seen other videos that I talked about how you can connect your, let's say, GitHub or Azure DevOps repository to Databricks. So you will see that repository in Databricks Workspace. So you want to make sure that you're defining access control of who can do what with those repos. That's another workspace object that we're talking about. So let's start with folders. And by folders, I mean, actually, let me show you in the UI. There you go. So if I go to my workspace, you can see that there are some potential shared folders that I don't have anything. But if you go to the users, under each user, you might have different folders and files. There, for example, MG has created another experiment under my folder name. So you will see some codes and notebooks that has been potentially developed by each user under their own folder. So in order to define permission over those folders or notebooks, you have to make sure that you have enabled access control over your workspace. How? As an admin, you need to go to your admin console, go to workspace settings, make sure workspace access control is enabled. So mine is enabled, perfect. If I go back to the workspace, let's say this folder, I want to define access control over this folder and anything under this folder. So I just right click here, click on permissions, and you can see that a specific person or group of people can do what. I can specify they can read, run, edit, manage. So let's talk about what are these permissions, and if I, let's say, give someone a read role here, what they can do and what they cannot. That's actually the slides that I have prepared. So going back to my slide, there you go. So when a person doesn't have any permission, so the only thing they can do is just listing the items in the folder. That's it. They can do nothing. But if that person has read or run or edit role, they can not only list the items, but also they can view them under the folder and even clone or export all those items out of that folder. Let's say codes, notebooks, whatever is under that folder. But the only person which is the sort of the highest permission is the manage one, that can not only do all those items we talked about, but also they can delete, move assets, and even change permissions for other people. So that's sort of the most powerful role you can specify. The access level you can define over a folder. So now the question is, if I do not enable workspace access control, which I show you, I did it in the settings of Databricks, what is the default access? So for the default access, if you do not enable this, is that any user in your Databricks workspace can create and modify any workspace object, which is notebooks, folders, experiments, models, which we're going to actually talk about machine learning models as well, unless your admin enabled that workspace access control, which I actually did and I showed you how. By the way, when you define this access control over your folders, anything under that folder, which is like a notebook or experiment, will inherit that permission from the parent folder. So keep that in mind, which is pretty important. As an example, if a user has run permission over a folder, that run permission will be applied to the notebooks inside that folder as well. So what is next? Is it just folders and notebooks that we talked about that we can define access control? Actually, this is just the beginning. So let's go to the next one. Let me go to the next slide. Repository. Again, I have already created a video about how you can use repository to sync your code from your DevOps or your GitHub repository, for example, to your Databricks and create jobs out of them. I will add that video to the top right up side of this video. So I assume that you know what is repository in Databricks. I'll show you quickly actually. So before I go through these permissions, let me show you first what do I mean when I talk about repo access control on Workspace. Alright, coming back to my Databricks, you can see that there's an option called repo. For example, I have synced one of my GitHub repository to Databricks. You can actually add yours, put your Git URL, and you should be able to get access with the token that you have from any Git provider, GitHub, GitLab, DevOps, Azure DevOps, so on and so forth. So I think mine is GitHub I did before, but now I want to make sure I do define access control over this one too. So pretty easy, the same, very similar to what we did with folders. You just click here, go to permissions, and you can define person and the permission level here. So for example, myself can manage, I'm also the admin, and you can actually choose team, not just individuals, for giving permission. And we have read permission, run, edit, manage. So let's go back to the slides and figure out what they can do with these permissions for repository this time. There you go. When a person doesn't have any permission, they can still list items, but that's it. But when a person has read a role, they can see the items and even export them as well. But with run, they can also run the notebooks in repository, but a person who has just read the role cannot run any notebook inside that repository. For edit, they can do the same thing, but also they can edit the notebooks, but the runner can just run the notebook, they cannot edit it. And manage can do everything and also can change permissions for other people as well. So we talked about access control over folders, notebooks. Now we talked about repositories. So can you guess what is next? Well, again, we are talking about more about ML projects. So what do you deal for your machine learning journey? Of course, data, or better to say, features. So now you might think about feature store in Databricks. If you don't know what is feature store in Databricks, I highly recommend you check that out. Check my video about Databricks feature store. I'll add it to the top right of this video screen. So I assume that you already know what is feature store, which is a place that you host your machine learning features in your Databricks workspace, so you can share them among multiple machine learning projects and use the same thing for online or offline feature store for training and inferencing. So whole different concept that we already talked about in a separate video. But now the question is how we can define access over those features, making sure we know who can do what with our feature tables, right? So let's go to my next slide. There you go. And actually, let me show you the feature store in the UI of Databricks first, in case you don't know it, and I'll come back to this slide shortly. There you go. So here's my Databricks Workspace. I do have my feature store here, and you can see, actually it's from, I think, the other feature store video I created. I still have these features registered as a feature table. So on backend, these are just delta tables, which is an open source format with async transaction capabilities. So on the backend, these are just delta tables, but here I have a nice governance control that I can define them as a feature. Now, how you can give permission over this? You click on permission here if you want to do it through UI, and the same thing, we can define people and what type of permission: view metadata, edit metadata, manage. Now let's go back to the slide and see what are the differences of these permissions for feature tables. So for feature tables, the initial and the most limited sort of access control is view. So they can read features, search features, and publish any feature to an online store. Again, we talked about what is online store, feature online store in a separate video, but here is just talking about the permissions. But if you can also edit metadata, that means you can also write features to feature table. If you are a data scientist, you come up with a new feature, you have the permission to write it to feature store and even update description of a feature table as well. But with the person who has managed access, they can also do all that plus modifying permission for others and deleting feature table. So the only person that can delete a feature is a person that can manage feature tables. But here's a key thing that you need to be cautious about, that feature store access control that we are talking about here does not govern access to the underlying delta table. So again, I told you these feature tables on backend, they're delta tables. This feature store access control is just an access control layer on your feature store API, sort of, that we can view, edit, or manage the metadata. But if you want to define access to the underlying delta table, which is a format of data backend of these tables, feature tables, you have to use table access control, not features access control. Then what is table access control? That's a whole separate topic, that how you can define fine-grained access control over your Databricks tables that you have in your workspace, which by default all users have access to the all data stored in a clusters managed table unless table access control is enabled for that cluster. So when you have a table access control enabled, then you can set permissions for data objects in that cluster. That's again what I said. Table access control is different than feature access control. Just keep that one for now, and table access control is a whole different topic by itself. So just wanted to tell you what is feature stored access control and what does that mean when we define that here. Alright, so what is next? We talked about notebooks, experiments, folders, and now we're talking about features, and now this is the time we talk about models, right? And even experimentation or machine learning experiment or ML flow experiments that we do in Databricks. So let's see what are the access controls over those. So going back to my workspace, if you go to experiments, you'll see previously I did a training machine learning model through an ML flow experiment. And now I want to see how I can define actually permission over this experiment. And you can see if I click on three dots, can specify permissions, and the role are read, run, edit, manage. So what do they mean when I've been talking about, let's say, run over an experiment or ML flow experiment? So let's go back to my slides, maximize it. There you go. So when a person has no permission, that person can do nothing with the ML flow experiments. With the read, you can just view the run information of your experiment and list and even download the artifacts of your experiment. With edit, you can even delete them, create a new one, log specific parameters, metrics that you're running your experiment codes. And with manage, you have all of them, plus you can grant permissions for others and even delete them as well. That an edit person can do it as well also. So when we talk about access control for experiments, if I define read permission for a person or a team over my ML for experiment, that means that permission level will apply to all artifacts stored in that under that experiment, which is a managed location that under Databricks file system. So that means if I have no permission to an experiment, that means I have no permission to any artifacts, codes, whatever that is under that experiment. If I have read permission, so I have also the read permission over the files and artifacts under that experiment as well. Here, if I'm, let's say, using ML flow experiments, and under these experiments I have some files and artifacts, so on and so forth, as you can see here. Whatever permission that I have over that experiments, I have the same permissions over the files and artifacts of this experiment as well. So this is also important to know. And last but not least, out of those machine learning experiments, you might come up with a model. And you like the model, so you register it in ML flow of Databricks, and you want to push that model from dev to staging to production, so you know there's a model transition process in ML flow of Databricks. But is there any way that we can define also permission level for who can move models from dev to prod and do this sort of model stage management? The answer is yes, and here is the summarized capabilities of each role we can specify over the model stage management in Databricks MLflow. I'll come to this slide, but let me show you how you can do it in the UI, and we'll come back to this shortly. There you go. You can see here I have I'm in my machine learning workspace, Databricks Workspace. I go to model section. There's a model for taxi fare prediction, I think, that I registered before. If I click on it, actually you can see how many versions of that model I have, and also you can see if they're in which version is in production, staging or not, if they're serving or not. So if you haven't checked my Databricks MLOps video, I highly recommend you to check that out, because that video will have a very deep dive and detailed conversation about how you can do MLOps in Databricks and do the model transitioning, so you will have a better understanding what is these versions and stage means for a model. But for permission perspective, you just click on permission here, and you can see you can have read, edit, manage staging, manage production versions, and just manage permission levels that you can specify for your users. Now let's get back to the slide and see what are the differences of these permission levels. Let's maximize it. There you go. So for access control for model stage management, if that person has, or that team has no permission, the only thing they can do is they can just create a new model of their own model and register it. So nothing gonna stop them. But they cannot read others and do anything with other models. So when you have a reader role instead, you can view some model details, the information about models that I just showed you in the UI, you can see them as well. And also you can request that model to go to another stage, for example, dev to staging. You can just do the request, that's it. But when you have edit, you can also add a new version of that model or update a model which is already registered before, or sort of edit the tags and version of that already existing model. If you have managed staging, you have the same permissions, but you will also have the permission to transit a model between different stages, not just requesting sending a model to a new stage. You can actually do the transition by yourself. You can approve other people's requests or reject them. If someone gonna move model from dev to stage, for example, you can do that. But be careful, this role is just for between non-archived and staging stages. That's it. But for a person who can manage production, they can also move models to production and approve the request to production as well. And and for manage, they can do everything, but also they can modify permissions, rename models, cancel any model version, and also delete the models. So this is the strongest role you can have. So what we talked about today was some of the main objects, assets that you deal with when you do machine learning project, and how you can define access control and what are the different permissions in a summarized manner so you can leverage them for your Databricks workspace. Now imagine that in your organization you will have, I don't know, hundreds of Databricks workspaces. Several of them are in dev environments, some of them are in the staging, some of them are in production. So the question is, are you going to define all these permissions for all your Databricks workspaces separately? Well, technically you can, and that is a pattern is still applicable if you want to know. So technically it's feasible. But a better way and a recent feature that has been added to actually Databricks is Databricks Unity Catalog. So just focus on this nice actually picture here. Instead of doing these permissions for your data and AI assets one by one for your Databricks workspaces, what you can do instead, you can in Databricks account portal, you will define a Unity catalog. It is like a centralized place here in Unity catalog that you can define permission for all different Databricks workspaces you have. So you define your fine-grained governance for your data and AI once in your Unity catalog, and then you propagate that access control you defined for all different Databricks workspaces you have, instead of defining access controls individually on those workspaces. So that's like a centralized governance for all your Databricks workspaces. And but the way that you define Unity catalog permission and for what you can define, what you cannot, that's a whole different topic and conversation. I wanted to actually include Unity catalog in this video as well, but I figured out that can be a little bit complicated and a long video. So this is evolving. Unity catalog is evolving. For example, I was checking if Unity catalog can be used for defining permissions on feature store that we talked about, but they realized that based on documentation, as of now that I'm recording this video, Databricks feature store does not support writing to Unity catalog. So still you can write feature tables in the default Hive meta store. So that's a little bit, I'm hesitating to go details of Unity catalog. It's a bit evolving, but if you're interested, let me know, write down in the comments if you want a dedicated video just how we can define a centralized governance for all Databricks workspaces through Unity catalog, what as of now is supported, what is not supported. So I'll dedicate a video just for this topic. That's all. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope now you have a better understanding of what you can control within the workspace for your data and AI assets. And that can be a good reference for you if you want to know what kind of permission levels you want. You can just check out this video, and this slides that I had is sort of summarizing all the roles just in one place. And that's it. Thank you.
Are you a believer in luck? Then the harder you work, the more you get it. Take care, my friends, and we'll see you in the next video.